Honestly, just having such a small, lightweight yet fast wide-angle zoom like this just makes this lens so fun to use. And if the image quality holds up, well then I might be saying goodbye to my 15-35. Hey guys, I'm out super early today at sunrise, well, just after sunrise at this point, and I'm doing something a little bit different for me, which is shooting some landscape photography. But the reason I'm doing it is I've just got my hands on the new RF 16-28 wide angle zoom lens. So whilst the light is nice, I'm gonna get some shots, and then later on in the video, we'll do all kinds of comparisons to find out if this lens is any good.
16-28mm is a fantastic zoom range for landscape photography. The 16mm, you can capture those expansive, breathtaking vistas that make viewers feel like they're standing right there with you. And then you can just zoom out to 28mm, and then you've got more of a natural perspective. On the back of the camera, the 16-28 seem to be giving me punchy, vibrant and sharp shots throughout the focal range.
So I've been here a few times at sunrise and never got this shot. Using the 16-28, and what I'm hoping for is I'm going to wait for this sun to just make its way over to the right and shine through this rock archway over here. I'm going to probably get like a vertical crop at 28mm, and hopefully that's just enough reach for me to get the shot that I want.
So I don't think I really nailed the shot, but on the topic of reach, this is a great example where to get the composition I really wanted, I'd have liked just a bit more reach, which usually I'd have had if I was using my 15-35. Here's an example of the extra reach you get with 35mm compared to 28mm for times where you just cannot get any closer. But personally for me, this doesn't really bother me at all because it doesn't take too much of a crop at all to more or less match that field of view with very little loss of image quality. Let me show you quickly in Lightroom. You can see there's only a very small crop needed to give me the kind of reach that the 15-35 would give me at 35mm. There's one challenge worth noting though, and that's that 1mm difference between 15 and 16mm on the wide end, because it actually matters more than you might expect. As you can see here, there's a surprisingly significant difference in field of view. And at 14mm, well then it's even more dramatic of a difference. Those few millimeters can completely transform your composition, especially when shooting in tight spaces or when you're really trying to capture massive, expansive landscapes.
All right guys, now that I'm not worried about light, let's test sharpness, and I'm gonna put it up against my 15-35, the L lens, and I'm also gonna compare it against a couple of the budget primes within its range. And it's to see if, if you've got a couple of these cheap primes, could this new 16-28 be a viable one lens solution to kind of replace those primes? Or maybe you're someone like me and you just wanna know if this new lens keeps up with the L series 15-35. Because this is a much smaller, lightweight, cheaper option.
So here are the shots. I worked through a couple of key focal lengths on each lens, and we'll start by comparing central sharpness first at 16mm, comparing the 16-28, the 15-35, and the 16mm 2.8 prime. And centrally at 16mm, the new zoom is definitely the better performer. And actually, maybe even the prime lens beat out the 15-35, but step them all down to f8, and they all perform equally as good. And at 20mm, between the zooms, again, the new 16-28 performs just a bit better wide open. And I would say even at f8, the new zoom is a bit better centrally. 24mm is a different story though, as it's a bit of a weak spot for the new zoom lens, and both of these zooms actually, but the RF 15-35 does outperform the new lens here. But at f8, they perform pretty much identically. Now at 28mm, comparing the two zooms and the RF 28mm prime lens, the new zoom seems to be fantastic here, outperforming the 15-35 quite a bit. The RF 28mm prime is one of the sharper primes on the RF mount in my opinion, and this zoom just about keeps up with it. But at f8, I see no clear winner to be honest, they are all exceptional. Now, what about corner sharpness? Let's take a quick look. At 16mm, comparing the two zooms and the 16mm prime, the new zoom is much better than the others in the very corners when wide open. Even at f8, the other lenses do not quite catch up with the new 16-28, it just gets even better. At 20mm, the 15-35 has the better edge sharpness, quite significantly actually, but by the time they both step down to f8, they match nicely in terms of sharpness. At 24, the new 16-28 has pretty weak corner sharpness wide open, with the 15-35 looking much sharper and clearer. Again, once at f8, both are fantastic, and we have edge-to-edge sharpness, with maybe a very slight advantage to the L lens in absolute sharpness. At 28mm, in the corner, wide open, the RF 28mm prime is fantastic, giving us great sharpness right out into the corners. The 16-28 is just slightly behind, but it still beats out the 15-35 in my opinion. But by f8, the new zoom looks the best, giving us edge-to-edge sharpness, whereas the prime and the L series zoom lag behind just a little bit. So when it comes to sharpness for landscapes, this new zoom is genuinely impressive. It either matches or even outperforms the 15-35 L lens across most of the focal range. But to be honest, if you are primarily shooting landscapes at typical apertures like f8, then to be honest, the differences between all of these lenses basically disappear. By the way, I've uploaded all these raw files for you to download and pixel peep yourself if you really want to see the differences. And you might be wondering why I didn't include the 14-35 here, and it's because I actually tested it against the 15-35 in a previous video and found that their sharpness is pretty much almost identical. But if you're curious how those lenses or even some of the older EF wide-angle zooms might stack up against this 16-28, then check out my previous video where I compared all of them right in this exact same location. Before we carry on, I'm going to take a quick second to let you guys know the sponsor of today's video is Squarespace. As a photographer, having a website to showcase your work is a must, and Squarespace makes it easy. There's no coding or design skills needed. Just drag and drop and you're good to go. And Squarespace's design intelligence blends expert design with AI, which really helps you create a personalized website and unique digital identity effortlessly. And of course, there are the customizable photo galleries that are perfect for showing off your portfolio. And if you need a store, Squarespace also has all of the tools to set up a shop and handle many different payment types seamlessly thanks to Squarespace Payments. If you're ready to get started, well then head on over to squarespace.com/JamesReader and use code JamesReader for 10% off your first domain or website. As a portrait photographer, I find myself reaching for that 28mm end of this lens constantly. So for me, personally, this lens needed to absolutely nail it at 28mm for me to even consider replacing my 15-35 with this new lens.
So a great way to test central sharpness is of course on portrait. So I'm going to compare the 16-28 at 28mm up against the 15-35 and the RF 28mm prime lens.
And with all three side by side, without zooming in too much, they all look great on a portrait like this. The RF 28mm prime is a super sharp lens, so if I got anywhere near that kind of performance out of this new zoom lens, then I'm going to be very happy. Zooming in just really confirmed the same tests from earlier. The new zoom looks amazing. It's super sharp and super contrasty, and I think the prime maybe just about matches it with just a little bit less contrast, whereas the 15-35, as we saw earlier, is the weakest of these lenses, but honestly, to a degree that's pretty much unnoticeable without this kind of close inspection. So now I am really interested to see how this lens performs and holds up on a portrait shoot.
So that is all the sharpness tests out the way, but I've got a model coming soon, so I'm going to shoot some portraits with this lens, and I never shoot portraits with a wide angle zoom like this, so I'm pretty interested to see how these are going to turn out.
During this shoot, I pushed the 16-28 beyond just stills and captured some video clips too. I'm constantly switching between photo and video on jobs and on photo shoots, so I wanted to see how it would perform in this kind of hybrid workflow. And the results just exceeded my expectations. The portraits are contrasty, vibrant, and super detailed. Eyes and skin texture were rendered with great clarity, rivaling even the quality of not only the 15-35, but even my RF 24-70, which is one of the sharpest zooms I've ever used. And we're talking here about a lens that is a fraction of the cost, and a whole lot more comfortable as well to use on a long photo shoot. Is it the ultimate portrait lens? Definitely not by traditional standards, of course, but there is something fun about shooting environmental portraits at 24 and 28mm. So let's talk about autofocus, and I found that the performance of the RF 16-28 seems to be great so far. It is really fast and very accurate too. I've shot thousands of photos already with this lens in combination with either my R5 or R6 Mark II, and I have had not one single focus issue since owning the lens. It's been great when it comes to subject tracking, always seemingly nailing focus on the eye. Let me show you a quick speed test in photo mode, just so you can see how fast the focusing is for yourself. Despite using STM motors instead of the premium USM motors found in the L lenses, it's remarkably fast and snappy. All those focusing improvements we saw in the 28-70 have definitely made their way into this lens too. And the noise level, well, it's just as whisper quiet as my 15-35, which is really impressive at this price point. Still, the 15-35 is probably very slightly snappier when tested side by side. This great performance carries on over to the video side of things too. Here's some video autofocus tests where you can see again, it racks focus from near to far, fast and confidently with nice smooth focus transitions, and it's almost completely silent as it focuses. Just as good as the 15-35 in my opinion, but we can see that the 15-35 does perform better in terms of focus breathing. In video mode, the 16-28 really confidently and smoothly tracks focus on moving subjects, and it just stays locked on the eye without any hunting or breathing. These clips were all shot using the 16-28, and I actually picked this lens up primarily for video use, and it has exceeded my expectations in this department, and this focal range is insanely versatile. And what really elevates this lens for video is, of course, the built-in optical stabilization. If you pair that with any RF body that has IBIS, well then you get crazy smooth footage that barely looks handheld. And this has been a game changer for me with my C80 because now I finally have a lightweight stabilized wide angle zoom that doesn't weigh me down on long shooting days. I'm actually even using it right now to film the A-roll of this video. I shot some behind the scenes for my wife who's working on her own YouTube video, and I just loved the results. This was shot with the C80, and you can see how great the lens stabilization is performing all on its own since the C80 has no IBIS.
So obviously this wide angle lens is an amazing vlog lens if you're into that. I've got it on my Canon C80 at the moment, so I kind of look like a bit of a crazy person vlogging on a cinema camera, but I thought it would show off the stabilization just whilst walking and talking to the camera, just in case, like many of you out there, are probably eyeing this lens up as a good vlog lens.
And I've been impressed with the optical stabilization in this 16-28. It's going to be a great lens for R8 users out there or anyone wanting a lightweight vlog lens. Here is a quick clip on my C80 with the RF 16mm prime so you can see what it's like with no stabilization. And now you can see the difference that stabilization makes in the 16-28. It really does smooth things out. Now here's the 15-35, and I think actually the 16-28 stabilization seems to be a bit more effective. It's hard to know for sure, but my early observations is that just like with the RF 28 to 72.8, Canon seem to have made some tweaks and improvements to the optical stabilization here because it is really good. So let's cover a few final things, starting with lens corrections, because these days wide angle lenses like this tend to rely a lot on digital corrections in post for a usable image. But who knows, maybe this lens is different. Well, it's not. As you can see, there is heavy vignette at 16mm, a lot worse than the 15 to 35, even when it's at 15mm. And without the corrections on, you can see we're actually capturing a lot wider than 16mm in reality, and then cropping and stretching in post to remove the vignette and correct the distortion. You can even see, compared to the budget 16mm prime, it performs a little worse than that lens too. But ultimately, I think the final result does look really good, and from 18mm or so onwards, it's actually really well corrected, just as good as the 15 to 35, or even the RF 28mm prime lens at 28mm. I also thought that landscape photographers might be interested in Sunstars, so here are the results from the 16 to 28, the 15 to 35 and the 16mm prime. Now, I couldn't really tell you which of the zooms wins here, but I can clearly see that the 16mm prime's Sunstar does not look quite as nice as the zooms. So let's talk about build and handling, because this new wide angle zoom is really small and nice and lightweight too, weighing just 445 grams. It is really comfortable to use on a full frame camera. You can barely feel this little lens on the front of, say, the R5 or the R6 Mark II. And it's really nice to use over long periods of time, even when using it on my big, heavy Canon C80 cinema camera. In comparison to the 15 to 35, it's not only much smaller, even when both of these lenses are fully extended, but it's practically half the weight, and you can really notice this difference, whatever camera you use. The lens itself feels sturdy and well built, with a pretty simple design consisting of just two switches for autofocus and stabilization, and a command wheel that doubles as either a function of your choice or as a focus ring, because this lens does not have a dedicated focus ring. This lens is also weather sealed, which I'm really glad that's the case, because that is so important, I imagine, for landscape photographers. The 16 to 28 also employs the same retracting mechanism that the RF 28 to 72.8 had, meaning that when the lens is fully collapsed, it's unusable until you zoom it to 16mm. Which is where this lens actually extends the most, and beyond 16mm the lens actually retracts. Overall, I'm really impressed with the build, design and quality of this new Canon RF 16 to 28 wide angle zoom. So that's the RF 16 to 28, and this thing is a compact powerhouse that delivers exceptional quality at a decent price. For travel photographers, videographers, or anyone in real estate, this lens is a no-brainer if you're looking for something a little bit more affordable than the 15 to 35 and maybe faster than the 14 to 35. And I've been really impressed with the photos from this thing so far. The image quality is great, whether it is detail-rich landscapes or beautiful portraits, or for video, the results are all consistently impressive. But will it be replacing my 15 to 35? Well, definitely for me, because I really only, to be honest, use a wide angle zoom lens like this for video, whether it's as a lightweight travel lens, a gimbal lens, or for vlogging. It's going to be a great little lens to pair with my C80, where this lens for me just makes so much more practical sense over the 15 to 35. And to the landscape photographers that are watching, if that's your primary focus, landscapes, holding on to your 15 to 35 or 14 to 35 probably makes sense. Those extra millimeters at the wide end genuinely do matter when you're trying to capture those expansive scenes. The image quality difference between any of these lenses, whether it's the cheap primes or the zooms, essentially disappears once you step down to typical landscape apertures like f8 or f11 anywhere. The only exception, I think, is if you're constantly hiking to remote locations and every ounce in your pack matters. Then the weight savings of the 16 to 28 might justify sacrificing that extra width and range. But what are your thoughts on the 16 to 28? Does it maybe fill a gap in your kit? drop a comment down below because I'm really curious to hear what you guys think of this new lens. But thank you guys so much for watching. There is a link to the raw files from earlier in the description if you want to check those out. And I'll see you guys all in the next video.